heard of the trouble that his people and the city of Jerusalem was facing, and he was in great distress over this. And he goes to God in prayer, and he waits, and he prays, and he waits for a period of 4 months before he finds opportunity before King Artaxerxes, who he's a cupbearer for. He finds opportunity to speak to Artaxerxes about his desire to go back to the city. And Artaxerxes grants that request to him. So he goes back to Jerusalem. Strengthened by God, he gets the people motivated to get to work in rebuilding the walls. They face opposition multiple times throughout this, particularly by Sanballat and Tobiah, various psychological and political warfare that they bring against the people to try to get them to stop building the wall. But they persevere, and in 52 days, the walls have been fully rebuilt, and the city is now secured. Ezra takes this opportunity with the city secured, all the people gathered to bring the word of the law before them, something that had not been read for a great period of time. He reads the law to the people, they understand it, and upon hearing the law, the people confess their sins before God. They go to him in prayer and in worship. And that leads us up to tonight's study. A few key verses that we'll see in tonight's study. In the first chapter that we'll look at, Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 29, we're going to see the people enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, and his rules and his statutes. This is a statement that the people make. And not only is this relevant to chapter 10, but it'll be relevant again in chapter 13 as we see Nehemiah needing to initiate some more reforms even after this covenant had been made. The wall has been rebuilt, and there is a dedication of the wall. And in Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 43, it says, "They offered sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away." The very concluding statement of this book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah says, "Remember me, oh my God, for good." And we'll talk about that statement as well. All right, an outline of these 4 chapters. There is a renewal of the covenant where the people, where there's a signing of this official document and all the people agree to it. There are 2 chapters of mostly names, but it's about needing to repopulate the city. The walls have been rebuilt, but it needs to be repopulated. And there's a listing of those who populate the city, and as well as Levites who have served throughout this time. The wall is then dedicated, and a big celebration that goes along with that. And finally, chapter 13, Nehemiah goes through a series of reforms related to that covenant that the people had signed. There's this incident of needing to cast Tobiah, one of the opposers, had been given place in the temple, needed to cast him out. There's financial support of the Levites that's been neglected. They need to restore observing the Sabbath day, and Nehemiah deals with mixed marriages. So our first section for tonight, chapter 10, we will read bits and pieces throughout. We definitely will not be reading all of it or nearly all of it, but let's actually pick up in chapter 9, verse 38, the very last verse after the people's prayer. It says, "Because of all of this, we make a firm covenant in writing. On the sealed document are the names of our princes, our Levites, and our priests." And so then the first 27 verses of chapter 10 is those leaders who have signed this covenant, Nehemiah being the first one. Bit of Bible trivia, if you want it sometime, I would have to suspect this is the shortest 27 verses in the Bible. Usually when you have names listed, there's usually at least 10 or so per verse. It's about 3 for each one. So verse 28 starts, if you're looking for it, very early on in chapter 10. So those leaders signed the covenant, and then verses 28 and 29, let's read those together as well. "The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who have separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, to their wives, to their sons, their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and his rules and his statutes. So, question for you all, who was it that signed the covenant? And who agreed to it? Just in generic terms. The leaders and priests and Levites signed it, and who agreed to it? The rest of the nation. Everyone agreed to it. Everyone who had knowledge and understanding. So everyone was committing to this. Of note, at the end of verse 28, it has that language, those who had knowledge and understanding. We saw similar phrasing in chapter 8 when the law was read before the people, that all who could understand, it was read to all who could understand what they heard. And so whoever it was that was included in this group, those who could understand and did come to an understanding of what they had heard, they knew what they had done wrong according to the law and what they needed to do instead. And they're making this covenant, realizing the importance of the change that they need to make. And so I think there's some points to take from this. Those people who agreed to this covenant needed to be of some level of understanding to know and to agree to what they were signing themselves up for, so to speak. There were specific things of significant impact that these people were committing themselves to. And we'll see those specific things in the rest of this chapter. It couldn't just be on a whim or a moment of raw emotional high or someone who was unable to rationalize from what they had heard what they themselves needed to do in response. Yet at the same time, this could not be a requirement of perfect or complete understanding, right? They had just heard this law read to them for the first time in quite a long time. This was not the scribes who had been studying law for decades. This was everyone, someone who had not heard the law for perhaps their whole life. It was now just read and explained to them by Ezra. Those who had ability to understand upon hearing the law and the explanation of it, they knew what they needed to do and they took action. And so the action they take is entering into this curse and an oath. They are taking a vow before God that what they are putting their name to here and agreeing to, they will keep at the risk of a curse upon themselves. That wording of a curse will be important in chapter 13 as we look at something that Nehemiah has to do in his reforms. So what are they vowing to do? They are vowing to walk in God's law that was given by Moses. There's no vagueness here. There's no, I'm going to try to be a better person. I'm just going to do better. Specifically, the law of Moses, the law given by Moses that came from God, that is what they are committing themselves to do. And they have unity in this. They have a single standard that they all have understanding of together and that they are committing themselves to together. And so they proceed to spell out exactly what they're vowing to do. In verse 30, it says, "We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons." So they are agreeing to not intermarry with their foreign neighbors. Verse 31, "And if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath day or on a holy day. And we will forego the crops of the 7th year and the exaction of every debt." So they are going to keep the Sabbath and holy days, specifically with regards to how they buy goods, timing of buying goods, foregoing their own crops, and exacting debt. They're going to give their proper portions to God and to service at the temple. We'll read just maybe the first few verses of this section to get kind of the general idea of the things they're saying here. So we will also, in verse 32, we also take on ourselves the obligation to give yearly a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, the regular grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moons, the appointed feasts, the holy things, and the sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel and for all the work of the house of our God. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people have likewise cast lots for the wood offering to bring it into the house of our God, according to our fathers' houses, at times appointed year by year to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. And then there's this concluding statement at the end of verse 39, we will not neglect the house of our God. So continuation on this same section with some other thoughts on it. This covenant is not new. It is a renewal of the very same covenant that had been delivered at Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 24, let's go ahead and turn over there. Exodus chapter 24 and beginning in verse 7. Remember the setting at this time. The Israelites have exited Egypt, have crossed the Red Sea, have come to Mount Sinai. The people are required to consecrate themselves for 3 days, and Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, and God delivers to him the 10 Commandments, and then all the additional laws for the nation to keep. And it's in chapter 24 that Moses tells the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules that God had spoken to him. In verse 7, it says, Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Very reminiscent of what we are seeing here in Nehemiah. But this covenant has required renewal at various times. After settling in the land of Canaan, this may be not necessarily a requirement, but Joshua took the opportunity as they are entering the promised land to remind the people of this covenant that they have made before God. Multiple times Joshua tells them to incline their heart to God and serve him only, and multiple times the people respond, The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. But in a very similar situation to what we're seeing here in the book of Nehemiah, under the reign of Josiah, it's been a long time since the law has been read. The word is read before the people, and they realize that neither they nor their fathers had obeyed it. And so in chapter 23, verse 3, it says, And the king, that would be Josiah, stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book, and all the people joined in the covenant. And this type of renewal, whether formal or informal, occurs numerous times throughout the history of the Israelites as they vacillate until that language that we have in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, until there was no remedy, which is what has led us to this point. There was no remedy, and so God had sent his people into captivity with this promise of a remnant. And now, 150 years later, we're seeing that the remnant has returned, the temple has been rebuilt, the walls of protection have been rebuilt around Jerusalem, the book of the law has been read. Once again, the people have understood it, and they have recommitted themselves to walking in God's law. Going back to the last 3 chapters we've looked at, chapter 8 and chapter 9 of last lesson, and then chapter 10 tonight, the people have displayed the steps of repentance. They have been exposed to the Word of God, and they have understood it. In chapter 8, they have gone to God in prayer, in worship, and confession of their sin in chapter 9, and now they have committed themselves to action in chapter 10. A couple life applications. Serious thought requires serious change. True following of God does not come on a whim. It comes from understanding who he is and what he desires of you, who you are and who you have been in relation to him, and what you need to do about it. At the end of Ephesians chapter 4, we can go ahead and turn over there, Ephesians chapter 4, Paul is talking of Gentiles who walk in the futility of their minds, darkened in understanding. And he says in Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 20, But that is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and were taught in him, as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. We see that renewal, even formally of our covenant before God is sometimes needed. If we are in a situation where we've come to understand that what we have been doing is departing from obedience to God, we need to repent. But sometimes it's not a single sin. It may be a way of life and an entire trajectory of life that you come to understand that is not in line with what God wants from you. A broader renewal might be needed, and it might even be a good idea, like these people, to write down what it is that you're committing to. What is it that you've been off course on and are committing to? And of course, our heart and attitude is vital in this and in helping us maintain that covenant that we are committing to. In James chapter 4, James is addressing people who have been friends with the world and enemies of God, as Reese brought up in our last lesson. And if we find ourselves in that situation, James says, beginning in verse 8, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched, and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you." Any comments or questions to this point? All right, jumping into chapter 11. The walls around Jerusalem are completed, but there's still a problem. The city is left mostly unoccupied, unpopulated. The leaders and presumably their families are living there, but everyone else is living outside the city. Let's read chapter 11, just the first two verses. "Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in the other towns. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem." It's obvious from this passage that there was some reluctance to move into the city. On the one hand, we might expect that there would be some enthusiasm to move into this once great city that's kind of having its new grand opening, but it's obvious that's not the case here. Why would that be? For one, moving into the city is going to require people to uproot their homes where they've settled. We know from Haggai and other places that the people have built up their own houses and they feel settled where they are at. And moving to the city is going to require work. Although the temple has been rebuilt, the walls of protection have been rebuilt, the city has been a ghost town for 150 years. Rebuilding of the city itself is still needed, and it's going to require much work. But the city needs people, and they need to find a way to get them to move in. Despite having walls, it's still going to be vulnerable. Even more, the festivals, the celebrations, assemblies, other events are going to be severely lacking if the city is left abandoned. And so they need a way to get people to move into it. What method did they use here to get the people to move in? Lottery, basically. 1 in every 10, chosen by lot. How else does it seem that some people did decide to move in? There does seem to be some voluntary moving in. It says, people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. So there were some who were willing of their own choosing to do that. David?
I just got to note that it's an age-old principle, I guess. Everyone's sitting around saying, well, somebody needs to go. I mean, everybody realized somebody needed to go, but they didn't want to be the ones to go. They understood it was important to go. They understood the good results that were going to come if the city was inhabited again. And they really understood that God wanted the city inhabited again. They just didn't want to do it themselves. And I'm afraid sometimes today we struggle with the same thing.
Great point. David was just saying, age-old problem, knowing what needs to be done, agreeing it needs to be done, but not wanting to be the one to do it yourself. Reese had a lot of names in his lesson last time. I think I could outdo him if I wanted to, and I am not going to. I'm going to avoid almost every name in this. Chapters 11 and 12 is almost entirely names. Well, except for the last part of chapter 12 that we'll look at specifically for the dedication of the temple. But rest of chapter 11 contains a list of the leaders in the city, and as well as the people who remained outside. Chapter 12, up until the dedication of the wall of the city, is listing priests and Levites. It's not just current listing. It seems to be everyone who had returned under Zerubbabel and those who had served up through these days of Nehemiah. In chapter 12 particularly, as it talks about the Levites and priests, it talks a lot about the organization of the priests and singers and gatekeepers, and all that's outlined there is going back again to previous instructions from David back in 1 Chronicles 24 through 26. We've talked a lot about how the genealogies are important, the listing of names are important, genealogies particularly for tracking the lineage of Christ. These people here, especially the ones who are moving into the city, remember there's only 50,000 or so people who have even come back to this area to begin with out of the millions who remained in exile. Of that, we have this small group of people who have chosen to do that work to go into the city. And although they may just be a name listed here, they were important to the work that was being done. And God saw value in having them listed here for us. There are some life applications we can take from this, though, even though jumping through the text pretty quickly here. Leaders should set the example and do the unwanted task first. The leaders were the first ones who lived in the city of Jerusalem, and so when we're seeing that resistance, the hesitancy, we know what needs to be done but don't want to do it, when leader steps up and does it, that helps get motivation and momentum. Followers are vital too, and we should take notice of them and commend them. Leadership and having good leaders gets a lot of attention, but so should being a good follower. At my job, in our department, we actually did a professional development course recently called followership training, and one of the concepts brought out was the importance of the first follower. This is a situation where you have a leader who is stepping out and going in a particular direction or task, but without anyone following them, it's not really going anywhere, and it often takes that first follower to step up and follow that in that direction, to join the leader, to really start the momentum for others to join. And so when someone volunteers willingly, especially for an unwanted task, we should take notice of them and commend them for that. Paul will sometimes end his New Testament letters, particularly the book of Romans, talking about seemingly obscure people who have worked hard for the Lord. And he reminds the people that he's writing to remember these people and to greet them. And there's always work to be done, especially in America. We can be prone to a retirement, sail off into the sunset mentality. And this is absolutely something that I personally have to guard myself against. It is true, we may come to a time in our life where, due to physical or mental ability, we are no longer able to do the same thing we could do in the past, or we may be blessed to no longer have to do the same type of work in the same way to provide necessities of life, but we should never view our work in this life as being done. That does not mean there's no opportunity for rest. God created Sabbath rest. We will have periods of rest that we can remind ourselves during periods of laborious work that rest will come, but we ought not to have the mentality that my work is finished, it's someone else's turn now. There's a great hymn titled "A Foretaste of Your Rest." I think we have it on the docket someday to be one of our new songs here, but I find it does a great job of striking the balance between our work and straining in this life while appreciating the rest that God provides. And so one of the verses in that, verse 2, "Should this hour of rest depart, and the joy it brings me cease, I will bear it in my heart as a promise of your peace. When I strain beneath new woe or contend with future sin, from this moment I may know you will bless my life again." So there is always work to do, but God also provides us the rest that we need. And so work needs to be done, but it is time to first dedicate the completed wall. And so let's read, sorry, I should ask, are there any comments on the last section before we jump into the new? All right, so at the end of chapter 12, or last section, beginning in verse 27, let's read parts of this through verse 30 probably. "And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgivings, and with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the districts surrounding Jerusalem, and from the villages of the Netophathites, and from Beth Gilgal, and from the regions of Geba and Asmapheth. For the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem, and the priests and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people, and the gates, and the wall." Continue on a little bit more. "Then I brought the leaders of Jerusalem up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. One went south," and then skipping down to verse 38, "The other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north, and I followed them with half of the people on the wall above the tower." And verse 40, "So both choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the house of God, and I and half of the officials with me." So what were some of the activities that were part of this dedication? Purification, absolutely. What else? Singing, definitely. Giving thanks, sacrifices, rejoicing. This was a dedication. It was committing the work that had been done and the result of it to God. This was not simply a secular celebration. It was directed toward God. And so first the leaders, the priests, and Levites purified themselves. So did the people, and they even purified the gates and the wall itself. This was not just any city. It was the place that God himself had chosen, and before presenting it to God, they went through a cleansing. This is also a celebration. It was a time of genuine rejoicing and gladness. It must have been a sight to see. And Nehemiah says he brought the leaders up onto the wall along with 2 choirs. Remember, it's estimated this wall was 20 feet high. So they get up on this wall, they're brought up onto it. One group goes south along the wall, one goes north, and they meet in the middle, or at the end, where the temple is, and they go in and they give thanks. Go into the house of the Lord, giving thanks. And it says at the end in verse 43, I'll go ahead and read the whole verse. And they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard from far away. Some life applications. When we come before God for worship, it is not a secular event. We need to be asking ourselves, are we conscious of our cleanliness when we come before God, and are we committing the work that we do to our God? Leaders take time to pause and rejoice over successes and to remind their people to rejoice. And all the work that we have to do, we need to take time to step back and rejoice in what has been done, and remember who it is that has blessed us with that. That is God who makes us rejoice. And any who are a leader need to be reminding their people to do that. We can get stuck in a rut of work, work, work without taking time to celebrate and rejoice and remember and give thanks for what God has done. Any comments or questions? All right, chapter 13. So just a bit of preface to this section. Chapter 13 is one complete section of text, really. Back in chapter 2, or Nehemiah, the preface is Nehemiah has now returned to Artaxerxes for some period of time. It says this in chapter 13, verse 6, "While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem." So remember back in chapter 2 of this book, Artaxerxes had given Nehemiah permission to go back to Jerusalem. When he did that, there was understanding that Nehemiah would return to Artaxerxes. And it doesn't state, Nehemiah gave him some period of time. It does not tell us how long that was, but we are told that he did give Artaxerxes a time that he would return. It may be that that expected time has already been delayed. Nehemiah ended up becoming governor. He's stayed in Jerusalem now or in Judah for 12 years, from the 20th year of Artaxerxes to the 32nd. But it says now in chapter 13, verse 6, that in the 32nd year he went to the king. And again, that language, after some time, he returned to Jerusalem. Again, we don't know how long that was. It must have been a minimum several months. It was an 800-mile or so journey to Susa, where Artaxerxes was, and then return journey. So many months, if not years, that he was gone. But when he returns, he finds that there's been much backsliding among the people. The covenant renewals and the revivals of chapters 8, 9, and 10, the people have given way to their former ways of disobedience. They've succumbed to foreign influences. The Levites, once again, are not being given their portions, and they've had to return to work in the fields. Sabbath is not being kept, and they have entered again into mixed marriages. So there's 4 main sections in this chapter. We'll look at each of those and how Nehemiah addresses them. So there is the casting Tobiah out of the temple. At the beginning of chapter 13, it says the Israelites separated themselves from the people of foreign descent, specifically the Ammonites and Moabites. It says in verse 1, end of verse 1, Ammonite and Moabite should never, or that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. Why them specifically?
Moses understood in Deuteronomy how they had not met their brothers.
Yeah. That was a command of Moses in Deuteronomy when these people had to be excluded because of what happened back in Numbers chapter 22, is what Moses in Deuteronomy was referring to. When the Israelites had come out of Egypt, it was the Moabites and Ammonites that, instead of helping the people, instead hired Balaam to go and curse them. And yet God took the situation and turned it into a blessing for the people and a curse for the Moabites and Ammonites that has stood to this day. And this principle goes all the way back even further to Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, where God tells Abraham that he would bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. But here in Nehemiah chapter 13, Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem, and he finds that Eliashib the priest has welcomed Tobiah into the house because Eliashib had a personal relationship with Tobiah. Not only has he welcomed him, he has given him a place to stay in the temple, a room to stay. And even further, in order to be able to give him this room, He removed all the things that had been stored there for the temple, grain offerings, frankincense, and other things that had been given by commandment for the use of the Levites and the priests. And we know that not only was Tobiah an Ammonite, of the group that's specifically excluded from being in the assembly, but also he has, along with Sanballat, has been the personal enemy, opposer of the people in rebuilding the walls. But despite that opposition and the curses that Tobiah had been trying to bring on the Israelites, God has emphatically blessed the Israelites' work, and he's defeated Tobiah. But Eliashib takes it on himself to welcome into the house of God. So when Nehemiah finds out, he is very angry, reminiscent of his distress at the beginning of this book over hearing of the trouble of his people. He is angry at the situation that he finds. And like Jesus casting the money changers out of the temple, Nehemiah casts Tobiah out. He doesn't stop there. He cleanses everything. He's essentially saying, Tobiah being here has defiled all of this. It must be cleansed before being restored to use for God. And then he brings back and restores all those things that had been removed. The next situation Nehemiah finds is the financial support of the Levites has been stopped, or limited at least. This decision that Eliashib had made seems to be maybe his own individual decision. That's at least all that it states. Perhaps the people had knowledge of it and they should have put a stop to it, but all that it says is that it was Eliashib's doing. However, for the remainder of the chapter, what we're going to see is that all those points that the people had specifically made in their renewal of the covenant in chapter 10, they are breaking those promises. And the first is regarding this financial support of the Levites. So when Nehemiah returned, when he found that their portions had not been given to them, what did he do? And we probably may not have time to read it. So basically, what did the Levites do? The Levites had to return to working in the fields. It was the people's responsibility to provide their financial support for working in the temple. If they did not have that, they had to go back to working in the fields. It seems it wasn't just a slight shortfall in their provisions. They had been completely neglected and were in a dire situation. It says that they had to flee to the fields. So much so that they had to commit to abandon their commanded service to God. And so Nehemiah confronts the officials. He says, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" The ones who had signed their names to this covenant, who had led the repopulation of the city, he asked them, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" Remember, at the end of the covenant they had made in chapter 10, their final sentence in verse 39 was, "We will not neglect the house of our God," but they had done just that. Nehemiah then takes action. He reinitiates the tithe and appoints reliable leaders. It says, he reinitiates the tithe so the Levites can get back to their duties. He cleans the house with a little bit of what we might call leadership reorganization. He appoints new leaders who it says can be considered reliable, and in an effort to ensure that this forsaking of the Levites' support does not happen again. And finally, Nehemiah concludes this section about the Levites' support by praying to God. In verse 14, he says, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service." This is the first of 3 times that we're going to see a very similar statement by Nehemiah in this chapter, and we'll talk about that at the conclusion of this chapter. So the third situation has to do with restoration of the Sabbath. So Nehemiah finds the people completely ignoring the Sabbath day. Not only were they breaking the Sabbath day as God commanded, but again, this was another specific point of the covenant that they had made in chapter 10. They're working in their wine presses, they're gathering grain and many other items, bringing them into Jerusalem to sell. Merchants from other places are bringing their food in and selling. The people are buying it on the Sabbath day. Nehemiah confronts the nobles. He says, "Why are you profaning the Sabbath day?" We're seeing a pattern build here by Nehemiah. He asks this question. He says, "Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." So in each of these situations, Nehemiah confronts the people about this. And Nehemiah once again takes action. He locks down the city the evening before the next Sabbath. So it's not to be opened. He closes the door, so it's not to be open again until the Sabbath, until after the Sabbath. He puts some of his servants at the gate as a guard. He's keeping the people from going out into their own fields, and he's keeping the sellers from outside from coming in and enticing the people to buy. Those merchants from outside still come up to the wall, and they're trying to get in and sell, and Nehemiah personally questions them and tells them not to come back, or he will personally lay his hands on them. And after this, they did not come back. And then Nehemiah again finishes in prayer to God, saying, "Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love." And finally, we find the people had married foreigners of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, again breaking a long-established commandment of God, and also specifically one of the points of the covenant that they had just made. Not only had they married foreigners, but they had let that influence their homes, evidenced by the fact that their children had not even learned the language of Judah, but rather the language of these foreign nations. The influence of the foreign nations in leading the people away from God is why God had forbidden these marriages, foreign marriages in the first place. Nehemiah again confronts the people. This time it's not the officials or nobles, but the ones who themselves had entered into these marriages or given their children in these marriages. And it says he cursed them. Remember, when they had made that covenant in chapter 10, they did it entering into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law. He's not cursing them in a rampage of foul language. He is bringing the curse on them that they had said that they were entering into if they did not keep the covenant. He beat them for punishment. He pulled out their hair, a sign of mourning that they should be going through. And Nehemiah again takes action. He enforces the people to take an oath, not to intermarry with foreigners. And similar to what we saw in the restoring of the Sabbath, he calls them to remember how the same things had been done in the past, and for them to remember what the end result of that was. Nehemiah then summarizes what he had done. Let's go ahead and read verse 30 and 31. "Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good." The third time. A couple life applications as we finish up. Leaders face problems head on and with action to correct the problem. We see this throughout the book of Nehemiah, and it's brought in full force in the conclusion in chapter 13. And finally, do not grow weary in doing good. We saw this prayer of Nehemiah 3 times in this chapter, "Remember me, O my God, for good." And he's made a similar statement a couple other times in Nehemiah as well. I don't know exactly what was going on in Nehemiah's mind as he said this, but I take it to be in the spirit of Paul's admonition to not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we'll reap if we do not give up. Doing good can be a lonely place, especially if it feels like you're the only one, and even more so if it's in the midst of people like Nehemiah faced, walking contrary to good, or even in the direct opposition of that. And this is what Nehemiah endured faithfully. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 10 through 12, and we'll stop there. "For God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love that you have shown for his name in serving the saints as you still do. And we desire each one of you to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Thank you for your attention.